Where do things stand in terms of negotiations on the economic stimulus bill?
Well, Kevin, after a very long night of negotiations, at this point it's down to shuttle diplomacy between Senator Schumer and Treasury Secretary Mnuchin. Very big pieces of this bill were resolved in a good and bipartisan basis. $350 billion in new lending authority for small businesses and nonprofits that employ fewer than 500 people. Loans that would turn into grants for those companies and nonprofits that keep people on payroll or that bring them back onto payroll. That's one, I think, of a number of very positive provisions. Broadly, there's agreement on immediate cash payments to individuals to try and put a floor under families who are facing very significant financial pressures. But where we haven't come to a final agreement is around transparency for the $500 billion corporate bailout fund that, at least as of the last briefing I got, still had a lot of discretion for the Treasury Secretary and not a lot of transparency. If we can't come to an agreement on the transparency and accountability provisions for that $500 billion fund, I'm going to urge my leadership to just take that off the table for the moment, and let's pass the support for hospitals, the expanded unemployment insurance, the $350 billion in immediate loans to grants for small businesses and nonprofits, and the direct payments to American families. That would give some real confidence to folks watching who are wondering what's the path forward. We do have to remember that mid-size and large corporations are critical to stabilizing our economy. I think what the Fed did this morning was a positive step. Frankly, we ought to be able to get this done. The Delawareans I've heard from want us to resolve this today on a bipartisan basis, but they also understand why I'm holding firm for some transparency and accountability in a fund as big as $500 billion.
Well, Senator, I mean, and with regard to that, I mean, what I'm hearing from you is saying that you want to split off, and other lawmakers want to split off the checks as well as the free testing components of the economic stimulus, and then leave the bailout bill separate. Is that what I'm hearing? And what are the chances? I'm just trying to get information here. What are the chances of that happening?
Let me try again. What we should do is quickly negotiate to a resolution, minimal, reasonable transparency and accountability protections, and pass the whole package. That's what we should be doing. I was just saying, perhaps in response to a previous question I'd heard, I'm saying if we cannot get to agreement on that, minimal transparency and accountability on this $500 billion Secretary of the Treasury-driven fund, I want to make sure we get everything else done today as soon as we can. There's other priorities I've been fighting for, greater support for states and counties, because an awful lot of the folks who are actually on the front lines today, the people who work in public hospitals, the ambulance drivers and paramedics, the orderlies and the nurses, we need to have more direct support for the county and state governments that employ our departments of public health and our frontline first responders. That's something that was a sticking point last night. I'm hoping to hear there's been real progress on that this morning.
I hear you on that, and I want to talk about small businesses in a second, but I want to bring it back to this $500 billion fund and the portion of this bill. You talk about transparency. Get specific for me, Senator, because a lot of folks are trying to figure this out in real time. Specifically, what additional transparency measures do Democrats want to see in this bill?
A positive step forward that's happened is that there is now funding in my portion of the bill, which is the Financial Services Appropriations Subcommittee. We do now have the funding to operate an accountability board for how corporations spend these funds. I don't see that there's yet final agreement on the language of what is the scope of that accountability board. As it was drafted last night, the last version that I got to see, there was very broad discretion by the Secretary of the Treasury. So, for example, if a corporation takes a multi-billion-dollar federal bailout and simply uses that money for juicing their stock price and increasing executive compensation, there was no clear mechanism for that to be resolved. If instead they use it to stabilize their workforce, to stabilize their operations, and they ultimately repay it with some modest interest amount, that should be the goal of the overall program. I'm not one of the people who's in the room that's finally negotiating the details. I am optimistic that we will get an update here within the next half an hour, that they've made progress, and that we'll have a noon vote. But I am willing to defend our core values. And frankly, I hear from people in Delaware, even though there's urgency to getting this done today, that they don't want a $500 billion corporate bailout fund with no transparency or accountability. The specifics here, the exact language, is being negotiated even as we're speaking.
All right, so just a final question for you. I know that you've done a lot as it relates to the small business portion of this,
Yes.
and you've been working across the aisle as well as with Democrats in your party on this particular section of it. We talked about big businesses, but talk to me about where medium and small businesses are going to go for help, especially as over the next 2 weeks they're going to have to be making incredibly difficult decisions as it relates to jobs.
I've heard directly from friends, from constituents, from longtime colleagues and neighbors who have had to make very hard decisions for their restaurants, for their hotels, for their long-established local business, for their regional businesses, by sending layoff notices or by holding back on them in hopes that we're going to get this done today. This $350 billion fund is available to companies that employ 500 or fewer, even if that's 500 in this location, 500 in this location, but they have some interlocking ownership. It's principally designed to put a floor under the restaurant and travel and hotel industries that are genuinely struggling, and the small businesses that so many of us are familiar with that are the backbone of restaurants and hotels. Those loans will become grants to the extent they are spent sustaining payroll expenses, and there are provisions that allow companies to hire back people who were just let go. Part of the goal here is to keep people on health care through their employer. We also have robust unemployment insurance provisions for those folks who work for companies that don't see that they'll be able to access these grants. They'll be administered through the SBA 7A lending program, and there's already more than 800 certified SBA 7A lending institutions around the country. In my home state, that's banks that are large household national names and local and regional banks as well.